So the year was 2010, and there was going to be a blood moon. So I rounded up a bunch of equipment to get a good picture of it. I love the moon. My favorite times have all happened under its pale light. I borrowed an awesome camera that could be attached to a telescope, had my laptop and various other equipment, but also strapped on my 40 cal pistol because there are mountain lions and coyotes in the area. I loaded all my gear into my Jeep and headed a few miles away from town. I get to the place where I'm gonna set up, begin unloading everything, and I hear some nearby sheep start freaking out. I didn't think much of it, and after a few minutes, they went quiet again. Just as I was unloading the scope, I heard a very loud splash. Basically, the layout of the land was pasture, creek, where I was, cornfield, and this caught my attention. I stood up and looked toward the creek for a second, but didn't hear anything else, so I went back to setting up the scope. Now I hear some rustling, twigs snapping, that sort of thing, and stand up and shine my flashlight around to see what I can see. I don't see anything, and whatever it was went quiet when I shined the light around. So I figured I'd scared it off and start screwing the scope onto the tripod, when I hear a very loud snap and whipped back around, pulling my gun and shining my light towards a fallen tree I'd noticed earlier. And there it was, roughly the size of a bear, but the head was more canid than ursid, and the body was more lean. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like forever, and then it growled and charged, and I screamed and fired my gun repeatedly. After the fact, I'd found I'd fired 8 shots. It bowled me over, and I fully expected that my life was about to end. But instead of following through with the attack, it just kept running and disappeared into the cornfield. Thoroughly spooked, I tossed the most expensive bits I'd unpacked back into the Jeep and left immediately, only going back once the sun was fully up to finish recollecting my gear. When I got there, I found a game warden, a couple sheriff's deputies, and the farmer that owned the field/pasture. Apparently, whatever it was had killed a couple sheep, and they were trying to figure out what it was and where it went. The tracks were both canid, but also not canid. They were strangely longer than a standard dog print. What was it? Well, I'm still not sure, and sometimes that keeps me up at night. Some have suggested it was a dog man, but I'm not sure I believe in such things. This story happened to one of my friends. His old neighbor lived in a really small RV park. Anyway, he liked to go back there to visit her a lot, since they were pretty close. I was his ride at the time, so I would usually end up hanging out there with them. The small RV park was located right off a main road that led directly into one of our small historic townships. The park was shaded by mostly tall oak trees, so it was often nice and breezy in the hot summers. Since it was such a small neighborhood in the RV park, everyone had no choice but to know everyone. While we were hanging out over there one day, my friend's former neighbor and her other neighbor started commenting on the fact that there were tons of ants. That was unusual to them, since they had lived there for years and never had that problem before. Eventually, after dealing with the ants being absolutely everywhere for a couple days, my friend's old neighbor decided to go outside and try to track the ant trails to see where they were maybe coming from. She ended up tracking them to an RV that was one space away from hers. There, she found several trails of them, both going into and coming from this man's RV. Everyone in the little neighborhood knew that the man who lived in that RV was somewhat of a hoarder, and he was not clean at all. So she knocked on his door a few times, but he didn't seem to be there, so she decided to tape a note on his door for when he got home. In the note, she asked that he please have his son maybe pick up some ant traps, and also to have him maybe clean up a little. The man who lived there was quite weak and ill with MRSA. I believe MRSA is a disease that can be passed through bodily fluids, and I also believe it is eventually fatal. Thankfully, though, he had his son around to do his errands and some other things to help care for him. A couple days after she'd left the note on his door, she got a knock on her door, and it was the man's son. What he had to say was the grossest and most horrifying thing I've ever heard. The man's son came by to take his dad to an appointment. He knocked, but didn't get an answer. As he was waiting for his dad to answer, he realized that he hadn't heard from him in almost a week, so he grabbed the spare key. When he let himself into his dad's RV, he made a morbid and terrifying discovery. He found his dad's decomposing body still in his bed, totally covered in ants. He ran out of there, and it didn't take long for a neighbor to find him sobbing next to his vehicle. Within minutes, the whole small community had heard the gruesome news. As it just so happened, I had taken my friend over there for us all to hang out again on the day his old neighbor heard the terrible news. We didn't even get a chance to sit down before she was already telling us about it. As she was telling us about all the ants on his body, I just couldn't help but to think about how ants come into your house, crawl all over your sinks, counters, and dishes, and even your food. So for whatever reason, the ants were truly the most horrific part to me. After all, MRSA can be passed through bodily fluids. We didn't go back there for a while after hearing that. When we did, though, they were still in the process of trying to move the RV out of there, and that was after a man in a full hazmat suit spent days cleaning it out. The whole thing just kind of freaked us all out, though, especially the damn ants, for real. My wife and I were living in an apartment in Midtown. It's about 10 p.m. and I was taking the trash to the dumpster in the alley behind the complex. The complex had only 6 two-story apartments, the front door of each facing south. We lived in number 5, and if you were to walk outside, once you open the door, there's a little raised landing where you'd put a welcome mat. Step off the landing, you're on a walkway, and you have to go either left or right because there's a very tall wooden fence separating the complex from the large house next door. So if you turn right and walk down past apartments 4 through 1, you run into a gate. Go through that gate, and you're now on one of the main streets in Midtown. If you were to turn left coming out of the apartment, you will pass apartment 6, then the laundry room, and immediately into a wrought iron gate. On the other side of that is the dumpster. It's a very short distance from my door to the dumpster, and with nothing to obstruct your view, you can see from the dumpster all the way down the length of the walkway. The entire area is well lit. Literally every unit would turn their front porch light on every night, so it was easy to see my wife open the gate and head up the walkway towards our apartment. I waved at her, and I have no idea how she didn't see me. I almost called out, but didn't want to scare her or alert any nosy neighbors. I was done emptying the garbage and started to walk home. As I approach, I see the door to our apartment open, and I see her leaning in. I could hear her calling my name, but she would not walk into the apartment. When I got behind her, I said hi, and she became frantic, asking me how the fuck did you do that? How'd you get back outside? I explained I'd been at the dumpster emptying the trash, to which she interrupted me saying, "No, you opened the door for me and walked upstairs. I called after you and you turned your head and looked at me, but didn't say anything, and just kept walking." And then she started crying. I searched the apartment and found nothing. We moved about 6 months later to the house we're at now, and one day, shortly after we moved in, my wife saw me walk past the windows that look into the backyard from the kitchen. She said that I walked all the way around the house, before realizing that I was in the bedroom. This happened to me and my then girlfriend in the summer of 2004. I need to provide a bit of context first, though. My hometown was decimated by flooding from Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Part of the response and recovery efforts involved FEMA setting up RVs as temporary housing for those whose homes were either destroyed or heavily damaged. These RVs were set up in a previously vacant field outside of town. The park was dismantled by 2001 or so. They put up fencing around the perimeter and trenched over the other streets into the area to keep people out. But they forgot one entrance, or left it purposely open for emergency vehicles to have access. Some friends of mine had found this entrance, and we frequently used the area as our playground. We would go back there to set off fireworks, turn the streets into a race course, and to have sex with our girlfriends. To set the stage of how this place looks, there were 3 streets running east to west, and a street that went all the way around them in an oval. The grass was very overgrown and about 4 feet high. The south and north side of the area was wooded. The east side had large dirt berms that were about 20 feet high, and had been placed there when the site was graded in 1999. They normally provided a climbing challenge for our SUVs. This particular day, my girlfriend and I were parked on one of the east-west streets, among the tall grass to remain hidden. We got undressed to have sex in the back seat of the car. As we began, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and there's a man coming over the 20-foot-high dirt berm. He's wearing denim overalls, and in his left hand is a full-sized axe. A wave of fear washed over me, and I yelled out, "Oh my God!" My girlfriend pops up to look out the back windshield, and let out a scream, and a "What are we going to do?" I frantically start looking for the car keys. There's a pile of clothes on the floorboard, and I can't find them. I look out the back, and he's getting closer. I can see his face now, and it's emotionless with a blank stare. I start grabbing clothes and shaking them to hopefully find the keys. They pop loose and fall to the floor. I grab them and immediately jump into the driver's seat, still completely naked. I start the car, and my girlfriend screams, "Go!" I look in the rearview mirror as I'm putting the car into drive, and he's now within about 30 feet of the car. Same blank look on his face. I floored it, kicking up rocks everywhere as the tires spun. I got out of the abandoned FEMA park as quickly as I could. My girlfriend was hysterical the whole time, until we got back to the main road and were safe. We stopped about a mile up the road, and put our clothes back on and tried to de-stress. I don't know where this man came from, as there are no houses within a mile or so of the old FEMA site. He seemingly came out of nowhere. I also did not see any other cars at the site. I had done a lap around the park before we chose our spot. I'm not sure what his intentions were, as we didn't let him get close enough to say anything, but I know he saw us panicking in the car. Whatever his intentions were, I know they weren't good. The look on his face and the axe in his hand made that abundantly clear. I went back with a few friends a few days later, and there were no signs anyone had been camping there. Whoever the Axeman was, and whatever he was planning, let's not meet. Alfred's Gift by Lonnie7557. This is an experience that happened to me. You can decide if it's paranormal, or just a series of strange happenings. I wrote this story with a lot of details, because that's just how I like to write. It was the winter of 2000. I was in my hometown of Anchorage. On this evening I was relaxing on the couch, planning on watching another rerun of Seinfeld before turning in for the night. It is worth mentioning that my girlfriend at the time happened to be an Alaskan native. She had recently put the kids to bed and was taking a shower. My girlfriend's sister was visiting our home. She was staying in the downstairs spare bedroom. She was in town due to having some medical checkups scheduled for the following week at ANMC. We lived in a subdivision off Arctic Boulevard that bordered Chester Creek. This area is called Midtown. It's not too far from downtown Anchorage. I suppose the time was around 10 or 11 p.m. The moon was large and full that January night. I remember looking out the front room window, seeing the rooftops of the neighboring houses sharply silhouetted in the glow. My dog lazily snoozed on the floor next to the couch. Eventually, my eyes also started to get heavy. This was due to the background noise of the television. Mixing with the quiet white noise of the shower had a calming effect. The baseboard heater quietly clicked and popped, wrapping me in relaxing warmth. I soon dozed off. Suddenly, I was awoken by a sharp, jolting burst of sound. My eyes immediately snapped open in shock. This tone ripped through the tranquility of the peaceful night with gravelly croaking. There was no mistaking that sound, especially during the winter months in Alaska. This was the sound of the raven. I remember thinking, why the hell is a raven making a racket at this time of the night? I barely had time to finish that thought when I heard the bedroom door fly open and then the sound of hurrying footsteps. I look up in time to see my girlfriend, quickly putting on her robe as she runs to each kid's bedroom, anxiously checking on them. I sat up on the couch, still dazed from my interrupted sleep, trying to get my head around what exactly I was seeing and hearing and why all the commotion. I glanced over to the TV and saw static across the screen. The time on the DVD player displayed 3 a.m. in green light. The dog was up and alert. The hackles stood tall down its back. Suddenly, the sister quickly comes up the stairs. She had a genuine look of wide-eyed concern and alarm deeply etched on her face. Once my girlfriend made sure the kids were safe and asleep, she worriedly looked out each window. For what, I had no idea, until she stopped dead in her tracks at the window in front of me. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" the sister kept fearfully whispering to herself, slowly wringing her nightshirt in her hands, timidly shuffling across the floor towards the living room window next to her sister. I couldn't understand why both the sisters and the dog were having such an intense reaction. The scene was surreal. I found myself in a confused daze as I stood up and approached the window myself. There was the culprit perched on the handrail of our deck. I've always known ravens to be large birds, yet this bird seemed utterly massive this close. The bird was so black that its feathers took on a deep purplish hue in the moonlight glow. Its large, round, inky black eyes assessed each of us individually, it intelligently eyeing us up and down as it sharply cut its head from side to side. Yet it seemed to take a greater interest in the sisters. This bird carried an intense, still, and heavy presence. It showed absolutely no fear of the humans that stood before it. It methodically stretched out its neck and opened its beak wide. A few seconds of silence passed, until it made a sound I had never heard from a raven before or after this bizarre night. The mournful cry it made reminded me of the wail of a small infant. The raven slowly weaved its head in a low figure-8 pattern as it made this continuous cry. The moment that sound filled the night air, a cold chill prickled down my neck and across my back. I was filled with a sense of loneliness I had never felt before. I quickly glanced over at the sisters. They were tightly clinging to each other, knuckles white, with teary eyes keenly locked on the bird's bizarre display. I immediately thought that I was witnessing something I was not meant to see. I was very much an interloper in a personal exchange. Once the bird finished this almost ritual-like behavior, it quietly eyed both the women for a few more moments before leaping off into the night. An item lay where the bird once perched on the railing. Curiosity getting the best of me, mixed with the desperate need to escape the strange and awkward atmosphere that overcame the room, I heaved open the half-frozen sliding door to enter the deck to retrieve the item. The weather outside being bitterly cold, I instantly regretted my decision, as my body went into an immediate shiver. The skin on my face was tightening while my ears and nose burned painfully. The snow squeaked loudly beneath my bare feet as I gingerly approached the item. The mystery gift left behind soon became clear. A small bundle of needles from a spruce tree lay on the barren rail. Clearly, the women were both shaken to their core that night. A quiet melancholy soon followed and lingered heavily on the sisters, continuing through the following days after the bird's departure. The reason why was unknown to each of us, yet I had a strong gut feeling that it was not my place to talk about what we each saw. A few days passed. Once I got off work, the three of us decided to take the dog for a walk on a community trail not far behind our subdivision. Heavy cloud cover filled the sky over Anchorage that evening. Large snowflakes slowly fell. The walk was mainly dark, except for the occasional light pole that sparsely dotted the trail, washing the path in a fluorescent glow. The sounds of 6 p.m. city traffic droned in the background. We talked amongst ourselves when we heard a man's low, weak cry for help in the darkness ahead. We immediately stopped and listened. The dog's ears snapped forward, head pointing slightly off the trail. A long, whimper-like growl emitted from the animal's core, followed by a concerned huff. Once more, we hear a weak, agonized voice call out, pleading for God's intervention. The cry drifted through the snow-laden spruce trees that lined the trail. I glanced down and noticed a footpath in the snow leading through the woodland in the direction of the cries. I handed the dog's leash to the sisters and told them to stay put. Both women sharply pleaded for me not to go, as I continued into the murk to investigate. As I wove my way through the tiny trail, my feet busted through the upper crust of snow, and I sunk to thigh depth. I continued to slog my way forward. Before long, I came to a clearing in the trail. In the darkness, I could make out the silhouette of a lone tent. I called out as I approached, only to be met with silence. When I got closer, I noticed a battered tarp draped over the tent shell haphazardly. An inch of snow lay on the tarp, and the cheap tent bowed under the weight. The unzipped entrance gave the appearance of a gaping black mouth in the gloom. I strained to look inside and called out a sharp hello. Not a sound or any movement came from the tent. My concentration was suddenly broken. Irritated and worried calls from the sisters rang out, demanding for me to come back. As I made my way back, I investigated the campsite. Piles of trash littered the area in dark mounds, scattered empty food containers, white trash bags ripped open full of miscellaneous used clothing, broken children's toys laid beside empty beer and alcohol containers, piles of empty aerosols peeked through the snow, frozen clothing hanging from the hacked-up trees that surrounded the site. A deep, low sobbing drifted from behind me down the trail from where I came. The women again loudly shouted for my return with urgency. I quickly made my way back to the sisters. They both pointed in the direction where the cry came from. The focus was down the wide main trail that eventually opened into an empty city park named the Valley of the Moon. We called out as we cautiously searched the entire park. The only response was the muffled noise of a city in the winter. We made our way to a metal-roofed pavilion. Underneath the structure sat a few graffitied, weather-beaten picnic tables. This area was the only spot in the park not covered in snow. We decided at this point that it would be best to call APD and inform them of everything. We did precisely that. APD arrived, performed a search, and found nothing. Being late, we now started for home. We were making our way through the playground, passing a tall, rocket-shaped jungle gym, when the sister gave a sharp, loud gasp. We glanced over to see what she was looking at. The city lights reflected a deep red hue on the heavy, snow-laden clouds, revealing a large black silhouette of a raven who sat silently perched. We all felt the familiar heaviness of its gaze. My stomach tightened as we continued forward, lowering our faces from the pelting snow, while picking up our pace in our walk home. 2 days later, the morning came for the sister to leave. We were getting ready to drop her off at the airport when my home phone rang. My girlfriend answered. I was loading the sister's bags into the truck when I heard loud shouting and screams coming from the house. I soon found both women crying hysterically for their nephew. Alfred was a quiet boy who grew into an even quieter young man. He was raised in a village in southeast Alaska by his grandparents and aunties. Alfred became heavily addicted to alcohol. So much so, his family sent him to Anchorage in hopes of treatment. Unfortunately, the treatment never took hold after many attempts. Eventually, he found himself homeless on the streets of Anchorage. He was ashamed of his situation and refused to return home. Ignoring his family's pleas, he steadily continued to sink deeper into his addiction. Alfred became a living ghost in the urban landscape. He survived living hand-to-mouth by panhandling and stealing. Being afraid to sleep at the local homeless shelters at night, Alfred preferred to sleep where he could. One cold night he closed his eyes and never opened them again. The Spenard Community Patrol found his frozen body early the following day. The police report stated Alfred's body was found in a fetal position. The man was lying on top of a picnic table, underneath the pavilion at the Valley of the Moon Park. When found, it was also mentioned that his body was covered in spruce boughs, in a desperate attempt to stay warm. The night Alfred died was the very night we received our visit and gift from the mysterious raven. Unbeknownst to us, 3 days after Alfred's death, we heard the sad cries for help in the park. The same park where he died. I often wonder, looking back, if the raven kept silent watch over him that bitterly cold night when he passed away. Maybe Alfred was able to catch a glimpse of its dark silhouette in the yellow moonlight high up on its perch. Perhaps he also felt the heavy gaze upon him during his final moments. We will never know. I like to tell myself the bird was there, and Alfred found comfort in its gaze, knowing he was not alone. He would have a companion during his final walk through the dark wilderness, in his eternal journey home. The sisters and their family never once referred to this mysterious bird as Raven. They called it by its original ancient name, the name given to it by their people in myths and legends centuries ago. The sacred name of Yesh. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. So, were you surprised to see me? Alright, well, I missed you. Things have just been crazy for a bit. But it is that time of year. I think I've talked about this every year. Maybe not one of them. I'm not really sure, but 4th of July is in a couple weeks. So if you're not going to stay with your pets, cut off any access for them to go outside. A shitload of dogs are going to get lost on the 4th of July. because they think it's the apocalypse. So just as a friendly reminder, if you're going to leave your dog home, lock it up. You know, cats might be a different thing. If your cat's an outside cat that roams, it might go hide and stick around, but a dog's just going to take off and not know where it's at. So anyway, it's going to be nice to hear from a lot of you. I'll be happy to see you, and I'm glad to be back. And that's about it. So be good to animals, even people. So.
Gel, Snemak, Bergsbus, Herish.